Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another NRG Oncology podcast episode. This month, we were inspired by none other than the great Dr. Seuss. Stephen was reading the Dr. Seuss's Big Dog, Little Dog book to his kids and came up with this idea about doing a podcast on the challenges faced by big cancer centers compared to those faced by small cancer centers. For those of you unfamiliar with Big Dog, Little Dog, the big dog, Fred, and the little dog, Ted, face all kinds of challenges related to their different sizes. And we believe there will be a lot of interest in how small versus large cancer centers deal with strategy and challenges for NRG oncology trials.
For the first part of this podcast series, we'll be focusing on the little dog part. And for this reason, we're focusing on a small community-based cancer center that's close to my heart, having grown up in Hawaii. Our guest is Dr. Naoto Ueno, who's director of the University of Hawaii Cancer Center. Dr. Ueno, first off, I want to congratulate you on the recent 5-year renewal of the University of Hawaii Cancer Center grant. Before we get into the strategy and challenges of NRG oncology and NCI-sponsored trials in Hawaii, could you first just give us a broad overview of your NRG oncology trial program and tell us why this program is important to the University of Hawaii and perhaps to the broader state of Hawaii in general?
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. So University of Hawaii Cancer Center is structured in a very different way that the NCI Designated Cancer Center is the center of the hub of the clinical trials. But that said, on the conduct of the clinical trials, the NRG study is a very essential part of what we do. We collaborate with our community oncologists, combine with our academic physician, and we promote the NRG studies among the patient that we think they're eligible. We have one of the most diverse state in terms of race and ethnicity. So culturally sensitive approach is very important of how to promote these studies, and simply saying that here's a study and would you be interested will not work very well. So therefore, when we actually look into NRG studies or any other studies, we pay attention in terms of, one, what is the need based on the people who's looking for. And sometimes, for example, I just use the example like here in Hawaii, gastric cancer, hepatoma, there is much more higher need, or pancreatic cancer, and comparing to other type of disease. And then breast and lung is important. And that said that the breast and lung behaves more aggressively.
One of the other reasons we invited you for this podcast series is that you have a unique perspective of having moved from MD Anderson, one of the largest cancer centers in the world, to the University of Hawaii. Now, I personally think living and working in Hawaii sounds incredible, but many may also think of some of the disadvantages of moving away from such a large center and its resources. Tell me, though, what are the advantages of being in a smaller environment, especially as it relates to NRG trials? Is it in some ways easier to build the relationships and political capital to support NCI-sponsored trials in a place like Hawaii?
I would not say that it's easier. In some way, it is requires additional effort for understanding of clinical trials. And it's not simply about clinical trials. As I mentioned, that there is a distrust, and it's not just small is the issue that we have. Yeah, so there's a lot of challenges that I have to say in addition comparing to the larger cancer center. But that said, we have one advantage that's very different from the other places. The University of Hawaii Cancer Center has been thriving based on how to conduct community outreach. We're very good at culturally sensitive, competent approach comparing to other places. And it's not that we're good from the beginning, but it's the nature of the community that we serve. And that is always our priority of how we think about clinical trials. So there's a lot of disadvantage, but the reality is that we're very proud of what we do. What we do here could be a role model for other places in the United States. One of the reasons I left MD Anderson is because of this reason. I was really enjoying what I could do at MD Anderson. There were many things that's fantastic, and there was no reason for me to leave. But in my mind, I was concerned that whatever I do at MD Anderson generally cannot be applied where resources not sufficient. So the way I see it is an opportunity to build something that's not available in large cancer center.
So on that note, I want to ask you, what has been your biggest challenge thus far with the NCI-sponsored trial program in a small community-based environment like Hawaii? And what kind of solutions have you found so far? Is there anything that we could do at NRG Oncology to make your life easier, which might be more broadly applied to community-based programs that are similar to the University of Hawaii?
I think that one of the biggest challenges is eligibility. Many of the eligibility is getting more complex, and it is very difficult to find a patient. And when I say find a patient, one is the reality of what type of patient we have, but second, it is very difficult for our oncologists to remember every single eligibility. And we're supposed to screen these cases. So we have a dramatic drop of how many patients we could enroll due to this complexity that people are bringing into the studies. Now, people talk about simplifying the studies. It has not happened. The other is the need for how often the patient needs to come to the clinic. As I mentioned, in Hawaii, people live in Oahu. About 1 million people live here, but zero point 0.4 million people live outside of Oahu. So there's a geographic access issue. So people cannot go back and forth that easily. So we lose the moment that, you put a very complicated follow-up or intense follow-up, it's really difficult to conducts these studies.
That's a really unique perspective, especially about the care access. It's easy to think of large cities on Oahu as not really being so community-based, but it's very true that access problems across the islands would be potentially insurmountable for a lot of patients. Now, switching gears a little, you've been hugely successful as a grantsman throughout your career. And after only 2 years on the job, and as Stephen mentioned earlier, you have already secured 5-year NCI funding for the University of Hawaii Cancer Center.
That's correct. Yeah.
That's wonderful. What is your recipe for success with grantsmanship, and what advice would you give to a cancer center director of a small program out there who might be nervous about getting their cancer center grant funded or renewed? And can you tell us how your unique Pacific population played into the grant strategy?
Yeah, so I think each of the cancer center has its own needs, and I think this need or the gap really needs to be well defined and discussed before writing any grants. It's not me that really brought this success, but the team brought the success. And we work together to define that gap. We know why the cancer center exists and we know our mission. However, the key is to revisit the vision. How do you see yourself 5 years from now? And we did spend a lot of time in defining the vision and defining what is our core values. So from there, we relook every project that we have. And the question is, does the activity that we have at the cancer center is aligned with where we want to go? It takes time. It takes a lot of discussion needed. And fortunately, we had a wonderful team even before I came. So I think the credit really goes to our faculties and faculty leaders who brought the success of the grants.
So, forgive me for asking this, but whether it's a big cancer center or a small cancer center, money is always the elephant in the room. We are always being asked to focus on the budget, making sure that we're fiscally solvent. clinical trials are very challenging to execute, whether it's a big or small cancer center. How has the University of Hawaii approached the problem of budget for clinical trials like NRG oncology trials? The reason I ask this is there are many community cancer centers out there grappling with the financials and the current NCI funding climate.
I have yet to solve this issue. However, I could give you some of the ideas that I have. And so University of Hawaii Cancer Center is really one of the highest percentage in terms of like NRG type of clinical trials. And unfortunately, many of these NCT and NRG studies generally are not allowing sufficient cash flow to be successful. Yes, we are community-based, but the question is, do we really are just simply a community-based? And the answer is no. We have a very robust consortium, and it's called the Hawaii Cancer Consortium, which provides sufficient money from the healthcare. I wouldn't say sufficient, but generous amount of money that allows from the Hawaii Cancer Consortium that help us to sustain ourselves. That said, in the long run, it's not sustainable. So we are really trying to balance between industry sponsor study versus NRG type of studies and how to balance this. And finding that sweet spot of the financial model is the job I see as one of the top priorities I've been working on the past 2 years so that it's more sustainable. And I'm not saying that industry study is more important, but sometimes you do have to wear a hat of a financial director and then try to figure out that balance. I'm not quite sure I'm answering your questions, but it's a tough question you're asking me.
You're actually answering the next thing I was going to ask you too, is this balance, like you've mentioned, between prioritizing industry-sponsored versus NCI cooperative group trials. Of course, that's a source of conflict for NCI and NRG oncology trials, is competition from industry-sponsored trials. But as you mentioned, financially, some balance is really important. Are you finding trial prioritization easier or harder than when you were at MD Anderson?
It is much higher because usually at MD Anderson, it's more like you decide the priority based on academic gap. Here, academic gap is not the only reason to pick the studies. We have to think about what is the type of the patient we have based on our demographics. And lastly, I allow the faculty or clinical trial office to determine many of these priorities, but at the same time, I'm constantly watching the numbers in terms of whether this is financially viable or not. And any study that's not viable, unfortunately, I will have to push back. And it's a constant battle. We have to thrive as collectively. And this is a constant struggle I have. I wish you guys could tell me what's the best to solve this.
Yeah, I think this is something that the entire country is grappling with in clinical research. I feel like, well, actually, one of the things that ASCO has brought up, a number of times is how every center, whether it's a large academic one or small community one, the clinical research program is almost always in crisis because of the current framework. On that note, as I understand it, the University of Hawaii Cancer Center is building a new phase 1 clinical trial unit, which will substantially increase access to industry-sponsored trials in the Pacific. How do you anticipate this might change strategy for NRG trials in Hawaii? I know that NRG oncology doesn't do a ton of phase 1 trials, but I wonder if you foresee any potential conflict between NCI trials and the new phase 1 unit.
I do not see any conflict. Rather, I see opportunity to synergize. We have a fraction of people in Hawaii that the moment they have aggressive cancer or cancer, they have a tendency to jump off to like MD Anderson. And we are kind of frustrated about the situation. Yes, everybody has an opportunity to go, but from the big perspective, as really representing Hawaii and U.S. affiliate Pacific Island, our goal as a cancer center is everybody receive high quality of care regardless of island they live. Even Oahu-centric approach is not truly appreciated from our residents. So building the phase 1 center really allows these people always thinking for innovative studies, and we want to really bring that innovative studies. And our goal is to open about 30 clinical trials, active phase 1 from 5 years from now. And I think it will help us to dramatically increase the awareness and importance of clinical trials. And this is where NRG or studies will definitely have more opportunity to put the patient. And we don't separate from NRG to phase 1. And currently the awareness is kind of a moderate. So I see as a good opportunity to bring more synergy.
Lastly, since it's a lot harder to gain fame and recognition, if you will, in a smaller community-based program compared to a large academic center, we want to give you a chance to recognize some of your unsung heroes who make your NCI and NRG Oncology Trials program work. You clearly have a really strong appreciation for your local team and how well you all work together. Could you briefly talk about a few of your people who really deserve a shout out?
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to Krista Ingram and our nurse practitioner who's really heavily involved in supportive care. We have Jamie Fukui with breast cancer, Jared Akoba with liver cancer, and Evan Wu like lung cancer. And clearly, our longtime faculty, Jeff Berenberg, who's really engaged. And so we have many faculty who's really committed to NRG studies. And we're very proud of their activities and their contribution to the committees and many of the ideas. So yes, we're small, but we have good faculties, and we continue to going to thrive and grow. I think we're in a very strong position compared to many of the other cancer centers due to our historical effort.
Well, Dr. Ueno, some of these names who you mentioned were personal mentors to me during my time there as a medical student in Hawaii, and I want to thank you as well as them, as well as for your insight into leading a community-based program such as that in Hawaii, and the challenges that come not only from the size of a program like that, but also from the geographic isolation and the unique challenges. The NRG Oncology Group is supported by grant funding from the National Cancer Institute, and content of this podcast does not necessarily reflect that of the National Institutes of Health. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and happy clinical trials.